We have been listening to the Federal Reserve Chair, Jay Powell, in his semi-annual testimony before the Senate Banking Committee. And among other things, he said that the economy may be bottoming out, but at the same time, the timing and the strength of the recovery remains uncertain, and repeatedly expressed concerns about unemployment. We bring in now our chief economic and policy correspondent, Michael McKee. Michael, we heard just last week from the chair after the FOMC meeting. What did we hear new or different today?
Oh, that would be one of the shortest answers I would ever give on television, David. There wasn't much new at all from the chairman. His comments basically consistent with what he has been saying, that the Fed, like everyone else, is in the dark as to how long it will take to get out of this hole. It'll depend on the virus, he said, but he expects the U.S. economy to do well eventually. Between now and then, he repeatedly emphasized the need for additional assistance. That's why the Fed's on the job, he said, and Congress should consider additional assistance. Pressed as he always is as to what that should be, Powell deferred, said it's up to Congress to decide, although when Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland asked him if they should focus on states and localities, Powell did say, that's what I would do if I were you.
Yeah, in addition to that, Mike, it struck me that besides states and locality, he specifically said is if they start laying off state and local employees, it's going to be a further drag in the economy. The other thing he said that we think that he's going to have more support for the unemployed, given his concern that, as he said, some of those jobs just don't look like they're going to come back.
Yeah, he tried to make the point that even though we had a good employment number and we should see more people go back to work, it shouldn't be a bad number for June. It's still going to leave an awful lot of people who are unemployed. We saw 2.5 million people hired in May, but that left 20 million unemployed. And the Fed's view is that we're going to see some rapid hiring back, but then it's going to stall out. And so that's where you're really going to need assistance. And of course, we have that fiscal cliff coming up in July when the extended unemployment benefits run out, and they're going to have to do something about that. Something else that Powell was very firm on was the need to do more of this assistance to help the most affected by the crisis, which he identified as minorities and women. He spent a lot of time talking about racial justice in the United States and how important it is to make progress on that. So the Fed is clearly on board with that. And in that, he offered support to lawmakers who are talking about legislation to help deal with that problem.
Yeah, and specifically said racism has no place in the Federal Reserve System. Thank you so much to Michael McKee. Now let's get a check on the markets, because the markets have been moving. They were up quite a bit. They came off some. I'm not sure whether it had to do with Chair Powell or not, but you know who's going to tell us? Abigail Doolittle. So what's going on and why, Abigail?
Well, it's really a wild day here, David. We have stocks once again all over the map, and probably very little to do with Chair Powell, because as Mike McKee was just saying, he really didn't say anything too much. So at the highs, the S&P 500 had been up almost 3% as retail sales surged in the last month by more than 17%, more than double the estimate. And then at the lows, up just 1/3%. The Dow Industrial Average almost went negative. This on negative virus news. Beijing is closing its schools because of a virus resurgence. Texas hospitalizations above 8%, a record. Florida cases have surged to a record. Now we have the S&P 500 right in the middle. You can see, though, that the stay-at-home stocks, the tech sector is doing just a bit better, 2.3% up versus the financials up 1.7%. So that actually tells you it's a little bit defensive. That being said, you have the 10-year yield higher, bonds all over the map as well, but at this point, once again, lower as investors want out. The real volatility, though, David, is in oil. Oil at the highs had been up 5% or more not so long ago, was almost negative, now up about 1%. All of this against the backdrop of this Fed liquidity, which is really helping this volatility. So much uncertainty, hope, but again, uncertainty, and that creates this kind of jittery volatility that we keep seeing day after day, David.
Okay, thank you so much, Abigail Doolittle, for that report on the markets. Let's stay with the Senate right now and turn to Senator Rick Scott, Republican of Florida. Senator, thank you so much for staying with us for this. We have a lot to talk about, but let's start with some of what we heard from Chair Powell, and specifically his admonition that we may need more help on unemployment, may need more help with state and local, so we don't have layoffs. What does that tell you, if anything, about the need for further fiscal stimulus, and when would we have it?
Well, first off, I think we have to be careful about how we spend our money. This is somebody's taxpayer money. It's either you're taxing people now or you're going to tax them later. So let's focus on the biggest problem. Let's make sure we have liability support, we protection for our first responders and our small businesses. Let's make sure we help those that have lost their jobs. Let's make sure we help our small businesses. But what I don't want to do is take fix the budgets for states that have wasted their money for years. They won't balance their budget. They just keep borrowing money, won't fix their pension plans. And like Florida taxpayers shouldn't be paying for that. So we've already spent a significant amount of money at our states. Let's make sure we get a return on all the money we've been spending, and let's help those that are still unemployed and help our small businesses.
Senator Scott, does that give you a different attitude perhaps toward an infrastructure bill? Because there are stories now that the White House may be considering a $1 trillion proposal. Do you see that more as an investment that you would get return on? Would you be in favor of that?
Well, I did it as governor. I believe in investing in our infrastructure. I took our transportation budget from about $7 billion a year to $10 billion a year. We invested $1.5 billion in our ports, and it paid off. So as long as you invest your infrastructure dollars in areas where you help create jobs, it works. What I said to our transportation department is, let's spend our money where we're going to get more jobs. And it helped us because in those 8 years, the private sector had 1.7 million jobs in my state. So I believe in our infrastructure. I believe in investing in the infrastructure, but we've got to do it in a manner, not just to feel like, oh, we spent some money, but we actually help our job market. That's what we need, more jobs in this country.
Senator Scott, let's talk about your home state of Florida specifically. There are reports of an increase in the number of COVID cases down there. Are you concerned that we may be seeing a real uptick that may slow down the progress of the economy in the state of Florida?
Well, as I talk to Floridians, I think everybody realizes now the risk of coronavirus, but we also know we have to open our economy. So our businesses are saying, how do we keep our employees safe? How do we get our customers back and keep them safe? And I think all of our families are saying, how do we get back to a normal life as quickly as we can, but knowing we have to do it safely? I know we're doing a lot more testing right now. I know that we're working on the vaccine. I know our doctors are working on, and our pharmaceutical companies are in the therapeutics. So I think it's all hands on board, but we got to keep our economy open and keep people safe.
Let's give your thoughts on the policing situation now. You've written an op-ed piece in the USA Today, really saying we should not be defunding the police, but putting aside defunding, really taking away all the money, are you in favor of reallocating some money so the police don't have to do all they do now, putting more into some social services that might reduce some of the threats of crime?
Well, we clearly have to make changes. We have to look at what do we have to do from a training program. If we have to look at what do we do to make sure we're solving the problems that that we actually have asked the police to do. But what I oppose is this concept that we're just going to shut down the police. What happened to George Floyd is despicable. I talk to law enforcement pretty much every day. They are disgusted with what happened and what those officers did. But you don't do it by defunding them. You do it by helping them. If there's a bad person, let's figure out how to get rid of it. If we need more training, let's do that. I've been working with Senator Tim Scott. We'll be coming out with a proposal in the Senate, but it's focused on how do we keep our communities safe and how do we make sure everybody has the opportunity to get ahead.
How does that bill that we'll see perhaps later on, how does that bill address the question of accountability of police? Because certainly the vast majority of police are really good people who do a really hard job well, but there are some, clearly, we've seen the videotape, that shouldn't have their jobs. How do we make sure that we get rid of them? Are you in favor, for example, or at least open to the possibility of adjusting the immunity from prosecution for police?
Well, here's the way I think about it. What I try to do as governor, whether it was through our university system or through economic development, is get a return for the dollars we spend. So what I've been talking about is, if we want the murder rate to go down, let's make sure we allocate the dollars where people actually get results. And if they don't, they should give us those dollars back. Because I want to get a result. I want safety for every citizen in my state. I want the murder rate to go down. When I left office, we were at a 47 or 48-year low in our crime rate, and it's because we focused on getting results. So whatever money we spend at the federal level, let's make sure we're saying to ourselves, what do we actually get something for it? I don't want to just spend the money to feel good. I want to spend the money to get a result.
And finally, Senator, we've talked before about China and the role of China in the coronavirus, and you've been very outspoken in the fact that something needs to be done. But is there any benefit either to the economy or to public health in really punishing China right now for the coronavirus?
Well, I think what you have to do is you have to look at China has decided to be our adversary. They have decided not to be our friend. And it's not the Chinese people, it's the Chinese government. It's a communist government. It's run by the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Xi. He has decided to not be transparent, to not help us. Our intelligence agencies are telling us they're trying to sabotage or delay our vaccine. That your friends don't do that. So what we have to do is we have to call them out on what they're doing, hold them accountable, and hopefully the Chinese government will change so we can have a working relationship with them rather than this Cold War that Xi is creating with the United States.
Okay, thank you so very much, Senator Rick Scott, Republican of Florida. And coming up, we're going to talk to Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, also a Republican. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for First Word News. And for that, we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you very much. Beijing is seeing a resurgence of the coronavirus. The city has ordered all schools to close in an escalation of containment measures. The Chinese capital is also lifting its emergency response to level 2 and said the people will have to be tested for the virus before leaving the city. The total reported number of infections has reached 106. That's according to the National Health Commission. There is progress in the search for coronavirus treatment. Dexamethasone, a widely used, low-cost inflammatory drug, has been shown to improve survival in COVID-19 patients who need breathing assistance. That's according to a study from the University of Oxford. Meantime, the U.S. National Institutes of Health says it will continue its clinical trial on hydroxychloroquine, even though the Food and Drug Administration has revoked its emergency authorization. As David and Senator Rick Scott were just talking about, Florida is seeing its worst coronavirus numbers since the pandemic began. Officials reported more than 80,000 total cases today, up 3.6% from a day earlier. Deaths among Florida residents were up 1.9%. In the past 7 days, Florida has seen more than 14,000 new cases, its highest level ever. Governor Ron DeSantis has attributed the uptick to isolated outbreaks in agriculture communities and increased testing. NATO is downplaying concern that the United States will rush to pull thousands of its troops out of Germany. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said today there's been no decision on how or when a troop withdrawal will happen. President Trump has said he's ordering a major reduction in U.S. troop strength in Germany. On Monday, the president criticized Germany for failing to pay enough for its own defense. He called the NATO ally, quote, delinquent. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, the Fed chair, Jay Powell, has just completed his testimony before the Senate Banking Committee. And in that testimony, he said that there is a recovery coming, but he's concerned about how strong it is and what the timing is. And two things he particularly mentioned were the concern about continuing unemployment and also the possibility of laying off state and local employees if the states don't get some help. We welcome now Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican of Iowa. Among other things, he is the chair of the Senate Finance Committee. So, Senator Grassley, thank you so much for being with us. Let's address what Chair Powell said, specifically with respect to Iowa. What is the situation with unemployment? What's the situation with your state and your local budgets? Are there going to have to be layoffs that you're concerned about?
The legislature just finished Sunday afternoon for the year, and they passed a budget for 2021 that didn't have to dip very far into rainy day funds. They didn't have to cut back a whole lot. And so from the standpoint of the state budget, it's pretty good. We do have $1 2/10 billion from the federal government that came out of the first $150 billion that went to states. And whether it's Iowa or other states, we're going to want to know how much of that money's been spent before we decide how much more money we ought to give to state and local people in July when we do another CARES Act.
So that's what I was just going to ask. Do you expect that there will be another act, a CARES Act, we can call it, by the end of January, beginning of August? Is that your expectation?
David, the answer is yes, sometime after the 4th of July, but before Congress goes on a summer break, August the 7th. And I think there's several things that we want to take into consideration that the House in the Pelosi bill didn't take into consideration when they passed $3 trillion that has a lot of things in it that are unrelated to the pandemic. Like, for instance, they put in a whole bunch of things about federalizing federal election laws. So let me explain, number one, how fast is the economy turning around? The faster it turns around, the less there'll have to be consideration in the second CARES Act. Secondly, I've already said about $150 billion going to states. Is that spent? And how's it being spent? And if it isn't spent, it can probably give them flexibility to spend it any way they want to, other than just the COVID-19. And then the other thing is we've still got tens of billions of dollars in the health care part of CARES that hasn't been spent by the states or even out to the states. So it seems like we want to get that out and see what the impact is there. And then the other thing is just to get a feel from the economy growing or not growing, how much short state and local budgets will be from the income that they're supposed to have.
Right, and you've addressed that with respect to the state of Iowa. Give us a sense in Iowa. Is the economy coming back in Iowa? What's the level of unemployment in Iowa? How's the state doing?
The state's doing well, except for low prices in agriculture and some of the problems we've had with meat packing. Although I think now meat packing got down to where a lot of plants were closed. I think we're back to about 95% of production of what it was a year ago. So maybe that'll make sure we got a good supply of food for the consumers in America. We got a great insurance industry. I think it's pretty strong. We've got good community banking. It's very strong. Our manufacturing slowed up a little bit, but Governor Reynolds did not shut down the state as much as some other states did. And so about 80% of our workforce was considered essential. She's now opening up the small businesses and the restaurants and the professions so they can go back to work. And then our small community hospitals, county hospitals that were hurt, where they get most of their money from elective surgery, the elective surgery is picking up again. I think there's still some reluctance of people to go to restaurants because of COVID-19. I've been to a few restaurants in Iowa in the last 2 weeks, and they're very sparse. It's going to still be a lot before they start making money, but it is turning around.
Senator, there was a time before pandemic, if we can remember all that way back, when the concern with the agriculture industry in Iowa and elsewhere was really imports from China and our trade relations with China. Is that still a pressing issue, or have other things really overtaken it?
Well, I think other things is overtaken from this standpoint. Prices of agriculture products are still very low, but we do have that agreement with China that was made in January. It took effect the last week of February. I've been watching it ever since, and also getting reports from Bob Lighthizer, our special trade representative. And it seems to me that China is trying to live up to their agreement, buying what they're supposed to buy. But the only downside on them not fully keeping up with their promises is the Chinese economy is not in as very good shape, and not definitely not as good a shape as China wants us to think their economy is.
Okay, Senator, I really appreciate you being with us. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. That is Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican of Iowa. In the meantime, politics go on apace, and we're now going to bring in our Bloomberg political contributor. She is Jeannie Zaino. She's a professor of political science at Iona College. So, Jeannie, there's so much news going on, whether it's Chair Powell or whether it's coronavirus, but let's check in on politics and what effect it has. One of the things that I think we're starting to see is some polls, particularly in some of the border states, some of the key states for President Trump, really moving away from President Trump. Is he starting to get dinged by some of his performance?
He is. I mean, we have seen polls where the president, now we are 3 weeks in at about his approval rating has gone down, according to most trackers. And that is a result of this sort of twin hit he's taken. You know, number one being his handling of the pandemic and number two being his response to the protests. Both of those things have hurt him in the polls. People don't like the way he is handling either of those things. And so we've not only seen it across the country in his approval rating, but as you mentioned in these swing states. And I think the biggest concern for his campaign right now has got to be the number of swing states is expanding. So he is now having to focus on states like Texas and Oklahoma, other states that he shouldn't have to focus on, where he is now potentially vulnerable. So as that number increases, it means it's going to take a lot more of their energy and resources at a time when it's hard to get out there and campaign the way he likes to.
Jeannie, insofar as the president may be facing some challenges, what can he do to turn that around? And let me ask specifically, Bloomberg has a report that the administration is considering a $1 trillion infrastructure package. Heard that story before, I know, on both sides. But if they come up with something like that in September, does that do him much good in the polls in November? Because they can't get any of that money spent. They can't get any jobs created in that time.
He is running up against a calendar now, but I do think his strongest area remains, if you look at the polls, the economy and his handling of the economy. People still have more faith in the Republicans and Trump than they do in the Democrats and Biden on that front. So he is going to focus and should focus like a laser beam on that. And the $1 trillion infrastructure plan is something, as you mentioned, we keep hearing over and over again. But I'm not so sure. I think he can tout it if he's able to get it passed. But in terms of actual impact on the economy, it's going to be very difficult to imagine we'd see something like that by the time people go to the polls in November. So it's really going to be a challenge for him. I think it's going to be more him talking about it from a PR and marketing perspective than actually seeing the impact in the economy itself in terms of jobs, which, of course, as the chairman was just talking about, remains the key concern at this point.
So Jeannie, people have underestimated Donald J. Trump before, and he's really pulled it out, including becoming elected president of the United States. Give us his best path to victory in November right now from where we are.
You know, I think his best path to victory is if he can repeat what he did in 2016 by going through the Rust Belt. And that is going to be a lot more challenging this point with Joe Biden as his opponent and given the fact that he is the incumbent. But his best path is still through the Rust Belt, and it is still focused on the economy. He's going to have to make the case, and he can make this case that even given the pandemic, he was able to bring the economy back to numbers that are respectable, and that next year, as we keep hearing everybody say, Mnuchin and others, next year is going to be a really strong year for the economy, and to point to the stock market, which hasn't been doing that badly.
Yeah, it's fascinating. At the same time, will race play a significant issue in this election, do you expect?
Absolutely, and I think that's why we're hearing the president today. He's going to be talking about this executive order that he's releasing. They're trying to have an impact there. He's also going to be talking again and again about the fact that under his watch, African-American unemployment went down, that he feels like he's made inroads there. He did pass a huge crime bill when he first came into office. So he has victories there to talk about, but his rhetoric just sort of makes it all that much tougher for him.
We forget about that sometimes. Jeannie Zaino, our Bloomberg political contributor. It's terrific to have you with us, Jeannie. That does it for the first hour of Balance Bar. In the second hour, we're going to talk to the AFL-CIO, person responsible for transportation unions. This is Bloomberg.